Hi, I'm Deborah Fowler, and I'm going to talk about texture overrides in Redshift and Mantra. So let's create a scene first. Create a grid. Dive inside. I'm going to change this grid to be cheaper. And then I'm going to grab another grid and do copy to points. So I'm going to change this one to be 100 by 45 and maybe 5 rows and 10 columns, and then do a copy to points. Okay, so we have our grid set up, and we can see that we need to change this to XY. And let's just pull this up, set this up so we have a camera that we can see our faces, and we're going to put separate geometry on each of those, or separate textures. So we have a bunch of geometry, we've got a camera. Let's also add a light since we're going to be rendering. I'm going to go into this light and also turn off the background because I don't necessarily need that. Okay, so now I have a light, some object, and camera. We're going to go into this grid and put a texture on there. So first we're going to need some UVs. So let's do a UV project. And what we're going to do is just go in here and hit initialize so that we can see that our UVs over here, if we tip our camera so we can see it, they are showing up, okay? And here's our specific image, so let me grab that and just get back to where we were. Okay, so we've got our UV project. Let's create a material to, while we're at it, okay? And we're going to assign a material here. But we need a material. So let's go into, not here, but into the material context and create a material. So we want an RS material builder. And we dive inside, and all we want to do is put a texture on here. So RS texture. Okay. And in this case, I could just put the texture map right here. And let's just do that for now. So I'm just going to choose one of my textures. I've got my material set up. Let's go back into our object and assign that. Okay, so we now have a texture on there. And in here, we're going to pack these as well. If we look at these, we've now got a single texture on there, but we want to have separate textures. So there's a couple of things we need to do. First of all, what we want to do is we want to override that texture. Now, right now we're packing it. I happen to know that if I do it this way, it might lose the UVs. So rather than pack it here on this, I'm going to pack it here. And just hit pack. And then in order to save the UVs, to make sure they're still there, what I'm going to do is grab and transfer the UVs, okay? And in this case, I'm going to throw a material node where we're going to do a material override down at the bottom. And this material, much like instancing, if you've watched any of the videos about instancing, this is going to give me a point override on the specific material that I'm using here, but I need to override a variable. And right now, I don't have any available. So if I look at this, I'm just going to turn Redshift off there, I really don't have much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back over here, and I'm going to create a parameter that I can override. So I want to override my file image, and I'm going to call that text file. And we'll just label it text file and hit apply accept. Now that's going to be our default, and I can grab anything in here just so that it has something before I get finished. Now it's doing this ugliness, so let me change this to $hip, and we've got our specific texture. Okay. Now right now I'm going to save this as demo so that I'm able to just grab something and it's going to automatically give me hip because I'm now in the hip directory. Okay. So now I've got my texture set up here. I also want to grab this, copy that, because that's the value I'm going to override to go into here. So paste relative reference. So it's now referencing that top level parameter, which is overrideable. Okay, so let's go back into our object. And down here, we're actually going to create a override on that texture file. Now, we don't want this. This is just going to be the generic one. What we want to do is create a value. Now, I could just create the whole expression in here, or I could use a little bit of wrangle node to make it easier and more visible. So let's do that. A little less typing. Okay. So I'm going to create an attribute wrangle, or if you prefer to call them a point wrangle. And we're going to go ahead and create a number. It's going to be an integer number, and I'm going to use that to go from 0 to 8 for the numbering on my actual texture. So first of all, I'm going to take a random number based on the point number, and then I'm going to fit that number between the values 1 and 8. And if we look at that in our geometry spreadsheet, we can see that I've got numbers, but they only go to 7. I want them to go to 8. So I am going to rint, or round up, that integer that I'm choosing. And now I have from 1 to 8. Okay, it's giving me a squiggly there because it's not sure. It says, if you want to look at this, it says implicit cast from float to int. Use explicit cast instead. So even though I'm using a function that should return an integer, I'm going to explicitly make it an integer. So now I have a number between 1 and 8 randomly. Okay, so I can use that information in here. I'm going to create a string in here. You do edit expression. And I'm going to grab this. Instead of saying all of this, all I need to say is $hip /text. This is all fine, but right here, that's where we want to change this. So we're going to add backticks because we're in HScript. And that string that we put inside here is going to be evaluated so that it gives me a value. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pad 0 so that I have padding 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3. And then I want to grab that number. So now I have to use a point function from the attribute wrangle. And then based on the point number, I'm going to grab num 0. And that should evaluate that number so that I get what I want. So let's hit apply. If I haven't made any errors, we'll look at our material overview. And we can see dog 07, 5, and so on. So we've got our material override pointing to a texture. You'll notice that it expands the $hip out to wherever the location of my file is. So we're happy about that. Let's go over to our Redshift and hit play. And it's still only doing one texture. And the reason is, even though I've assigned this as a point attribute, I'm overriding it. I've got a string that is appearing in my geometry spreadsheet as correct. What I haven't done is change one more thing, which is at the top level. And up here, what we want to do, let's just stop Redshift for a moment. We want to go into the Redshift object, instancing. We want to do Redshift instancing and instance SOP level pack primitives. And once we do that, we now have different textures. And that's all there is to Redshift texture overriding. So just settings on the top SOP level, making sure that you're overriding a point attribute, setting up a string that will evaluate to whatever string that happens to be, and then you're good to go. Okay. Now, there's other ways you could do this, and if you're interested in looking at those other ways, you can go to my website, and on my tips and tricks page, I have a setup with this very thing. So right here in texture override, there's a Redshift option. And there's also the settings that you would have on your top level. This is a technique that I use for a number of different things, including instancing whatever it might be to add variation on a string. So you can do it with instance names. You can do it when you're copying and instancing lights. So you can't copy a light explicit. You can instance a light, and you can create variations on that as well. And that's all in my overview page under lighting. Okay. So we have it working in Redshift, and we have our expression, which I'm just going to bring up again. So we've created a random number that we created in attribute wrangle. I could have done it here as well. It just gets a little bit long in the expression. We've padded our number, so it's 01 through 08. We've got the first part of our string, the last part of our string, and we've used backticks in HScript to evaluate that string to the actual value that we want. So we're good to go. So let's kill render Redshift and go to our scene view. And let's just go ahead and create the mantra version. So that's a little easier. We just do a principled shader. Now in the principled shader, we want to change this value to be pure 1 so that we're not diluting our texture because it's a multiplicative on it. We want to do textures, use texture. And here we're actually going to use our texture that we're going to override. But again, I'm going to put a temporary one in there just so we have it. And let's go back over here and test this. So the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of this Redshift light and just do an environment light for mantra. Because again, we're still not in the world of Omniverse where we can just magically make everything work. And then we're going to go into here, and we now want to change this to a principled shader. So if we look at that, we now have our dog pictures. And if we go into create render node mantra PBR, go into our renderer in here, and just grab that. And we actually have one there. Let's just do that quick. We're using that one. I'm going to go ahead and override this so that it is smaller, so we're not wasting cycles again. And that way we can get this to render a little faster. And right now we have nothing on there. So let's go and see what's happening with this. So we've packed it. We have copied the points, and we're assigning a Redshift shader. So let's change that to principled. And then we want to grab this name here and change the override to our texture override for mantra. So let's try and find our texture override. It should be under our base color texture. So base color, use texture, and texture. That's the one we want. And then we're going to paste values of that string that I had. And you can see, boom, it does it automatically. So it's a lot quicker and easier in mantra. There's really not anything you have to change at the top level because it's ignoring it from Redshift, but there we go. The shaders are now using an individual texture based on those various textures. So if you look at my setup here, those are the textures that it's overriding with. Okay. There's multiple ways to do this. So I do have information on my website with the HIP files as well. You can set this up in different ways. But again, these are just two very quick examples. If you're interested and you want more information, you can go over to my website and go into Houdini, Tips and Tricks, Lighting and Rendering, and down here is a texture override. There's also color variation overrides, but this is texture override. This one's mantra, this one's Redshift, and a little blurb about what to do with Redshift. So, thank you for watching.